Alana Brooks was just another traveler, until two officers handcuffed her at the airport with no cause. Young, black, confident. That was enough for suspicion. They accused her of carrying drugs, demanded $5,000 to let her go, and laughed when she said her father was the governor. They didn't believe her, until he answered the phone. The moment went viral. The fallout was national. One officer went to prison. A new law was born, Alana's Law, requiring body cams, written justification, and oversight for all civilian stops. But the question that shook the nation came from Alana herself. If I weren't the daughter of a governor, would I be alive today? Now, her voice is a movement. Where are you watching from? Because this story isn't just about her. It's about who gets believed and who gets left behind. The airport terminal erupted into gasps as a young black woman in a designer jacket hit the floor with a sickening thud. Her limbs flailed in protest, her voice piercing through the steady hum of suitcase wheels and flight announcements. "I didn't do anything wrong," she screamed, her face twisted in confusion and fury. Her arms were wrenched behind her back by two uniformed officers. One of them, a stocky man with graying hair, barked orders as if the terminal were his personal war zone. The other, younger, but visibly tense, snapped the cuffs shut with a metallic click. Travelers froze in place, forming a hesitant circle of spectators. Some stepped back. A few raised their phones. One man, a tourist with a vlog camera still rolling from his travel blog, captured the entire scene in crisp 4K. A black woman face down on the gleaming white tiles of Gate 32. Two police officers pressing down as if subduing a threat. But there were no weapons, no raised voices before, no warning. Just a takedown. "What's going on?" someone whispered. "Who is she?" another asked. "She didn't even resist," a woman muttered, clutching her child close. Alana Brooks was 23 years old, barely 5'5" and half the weight of the man crushing her shoulder into the floor. The red indentation from the officer's knee burned into her skin, and the cuffs bit into her wrists as her breathing quickened. "Let go of me! I'm not a criminal!" she shouted again. But the older officer wasn't listening. "Resist an arrest," he muttered under his breath. His partner's eyes darted to the growing crowd, the murmurs, the cameras, the consequence. "Rick," he said, but the senior officer ignored him. "Stand her up," he ordered. The younger one hesitated, then complied, hoisting her by the elbows. Alana stumbled. Her hair, once neatly styled, now clung to her face in wet strands from sweat and tears. "Why are you doing this?" she cried, her voice cracked. "I just got off a flight. I didn't do anything wrong." Her backpack lay on the floor, its contents scattered, passport, charger, a bottle of perfume. Nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, just her life in a bag. A woman in a green coat reached out. "This is wrong," she said aloud. "This is excessive." The officers ignored her. "Move back," the older one warned. "This doesn't concern you." The crowd murmured louder. Now more phones were up. People weren't just watching anymore. They were documenting, live streaming, recording every second. From a distance, the airport's security supervisor caught the disturbance and radioed the control room. "We've got something escalating at Terminal B," she said. "Two officers, female suspect, lots of cameras, alert command." Meanwhile, Officer Rick Dalton dragged Alana toward a restricted corridor. Officer Kyle Benson followed, looking increasingly uneasy. "Rick," Kyle said in a low voice, "maybe we should slow this down. Something feels off." Rick shot him a look. "Too late. We're doing our job." She said she didn't do anything. They always say that. 48 minutes earlier, none of this had happened. No cuffs, no crowd, no viral footage, just a smooth flight from Paris landing under the Southern California sun. Just another Tuesday at Port City International. Flashback. Same terminal. Same girl. But no chaos. Not yet. Alana Brooks had stepped off the flight from Charles de Gaulle with a bounce in her step and music in her ears. She wore high-waisted joggers and limited-edition Jordans. Her purple backpack sat snug over one shoulder. She looked like she belonged in a fashion magazine. Confident, fresh, ready to be home. Her degree in art history had barely dried. Graduation had come with honors, applause, and an offer to intern at one of LA's top cultural institutions. Paris had been a celebration. Now it was time to reunite with family. She hummed along to the R&B track playing in her wireless headphones. Her head swayed lightly as she walked past the glass storefronts and the blinking screens announcing arrivals. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Welcome home, baby. Your dad's staff is waiting at baggage." Her father, of course, was Charles Brooks, the sitting governor of California. But Alana wasn't flaunting it. She never did. She didn't wear her name like armor. She wore it quietly, respectfully, but she knew what it meant. Apparently, the two officers watching from a corner near the newsstand didn't. Rick Dalton had been with the airport unit for 15 years. Suspended once, investigated twice, never charged, always cleared of misconduct. But the warnings were there. Quiet complaints, anonymous letters, a reputation among junior officers. Don't question Rick. He runs the floor. And now his eyes were on Alana. "She doesn't look local," he muttered, sipping bad coffee from a paper cup. "Too much flash. Look at that bag. Those shoes. Those earrings. Where's she getting that money?" Kyle Benson, fresh out of academy training, frowned. "She might just be rich," he said cautiously. Rick snorted. "No. Girls like that, they don't earn it. They're either running with someone who does illegal stuff or they're mules. You'll see." "Shouldn't we?" Kyle started. "We'll see." Rick cut him off. And just like that, a plan was made. They waited for her to separate from the crowd. She turned down a side corridor near the domestic re-entry zone. Quieter, fewer people. She pulled her phone out, checked for Wi-Fi, then slid it back into her jacket. The officers moved, one on each side. Calm, deliberate, trained for this. "Excuse me, miss," Rick said, stepping into her path. "Mind stopping for a moment? We need to ask a few questions." She blinked, taking out her headphones. "What is this about?" "Routine check. Random screening," Rick said, but his eyes told a different story. Alana stepped back. "I don't have anything on me. I just got off a flight. What's going on?" Kyle spoke up. "Just your ID, please." Alana hesitated, then reached into her bag, retrieving her California license. Kyle glanced at it. His jaw tightened. "Alana Brooks?" Rick's head snapped. "Brooks?" he repeated. "Any relation to—" Alana's voice was calm. "I'm not hiding anything. I'm the governor's daughter, and I've done nothing wrong." Rick smiled, but not kindly. "Sure you are. Let's find out." 48 minutes earlier, Port City International bustled with its usual rhythm, clattering luggage wheels, the hum of gate announcements, and the distant aroma of overbrewed coffee from the terminal cafe. The late afternoon sun poured through glass walls, drenching everything in gold, while travelers drifted past each other, mostly too busy to notice the details around them. But Alana Brooks was not just another traveler. She stepped off the jet bridge with the relaxed poise of someone who had just wrapped a month in Europe, specifically a self-funded tour of France and Italy to celebrate graduating summa cum laude with a degree in art history. The air felt different back home, warmer, heavier. Her time in Paris had been filled with gallery walks, museum archives, and quiet moments journaling under cathedral arches. She had documented it all not for clout but for memory. Art was her lens. her way of making sense of the world. At 23, Alana carried herself with a kind of casual elegance. She wore moss green silk joggers paired with a crisp, white, oversized blouse tucked just right. Her jacket, a custom-tailored blazer from a small boutique in Montmartre, hung open, revealing subtle details most people wouldn't even catch. On her feet were a limited-edition pair of Air Jordans, one of only 300 made worldwide, not flashy, just distinct. Over one shoulder was her deep purple MCM backpack, scuffed slightly from travel, but unmistakably high-end. Her skin glowed, her posture upright, her eyes sharp and observant even through a slight layer of jet lag. Nobody around her had any idea she was the daughter of one of the most powerful elected officials in the state, and that was intentional. Charles Brooks had always told her, "Your name gets you a meeting. Your conduct gets you remembered." Growing up under the shadow of political scrutiny, Alana learned early how to blend in when needed. She hated being followed by security, hated when people looked at her differently once they knew her last name. So she never advertised it. Not at school, not online, not in public, especially not in places like this. She walked briskly, tapping at her phone with one hand, adjusting her headphones with the other. She smiled as she saw a message from her mom. "You looked beautiful on the graduation live stream. Can't wait to hug you." Alana replied with a heart emoji and a photo of her airplane meal still half finished in the tray. She wanted nothing more than to grab her luggage, meet the driver her father's office had sent, and sleep in her own bed. But as she approached the escalator down to baggage claim, two pairs of eyes tracked her every step from the shadows of a corner kiosk. Officer Rick Dalton leaned slightly against a column near the airport bookstore, arms folded, gaze locked on her like a sniper lining up a target. Standing beside him was Officer Kyle Benson, slightly younger, still learning how to mask discomfort behind the badge. Rick took a slow sip of his lukewarm coffee and nodded toward Alana. "You see that?" he said under his breath. Kyle followed his line of sight. "Yeah, what about her?" Rick didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned her outfit, her bag, her shoes, designer gear, latest sneakers, strutting like she owns the terminal. "That's not normal. She just looks fashionable, Rick. Too fashionable. This is Port City, not Milan. Girls like that don't fly coach unless they're hiding something." Kyle frowned. "She didn't look suspicious to me." Rick grunted. "Of course she doesn't. That's the point. You're still green, kid. You haven't learned what clean really looks like when it's dirty underneath." He took another sip of his coffee and crushed the empty cup in his hand. "Let me guess. Daddy's a lawyer, or a dealer, or some baller boyfriend's paying her way. You know how many mules we've caught dressed like that? Smiling, polite, quiet little criminals." Kyle looked again. "You wanted to check her?" Rick was already moving. "Follow my lead." Alana reached the corridor that split the international terminal from the domestic re-entry point. She moved slightly ahead of the crowd, distractedly adjusting the zipper on her carry-on. She passed the security desk without a second glance. The hallway was quieter now, less traffic, fewer cameras. Her pace slowed. She glanced at the sign for baggage claim, made a right, then paused to switch tracks on her phone. That pause was all Rick needed. The two officers stepped forward, flanking her on either side. Kyle's hand hovered near his radio. Rick's hand tapped his belt. "Excuse me, miss," Rick said. His voice was low but firm, rehearsed. "Mind stopping for a second?" Alana blinked, confused. She removed her headphones. "What's going on?" Rick flashed a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Just a random security screening, quick questions." Alana's posture stiffened, but her voice remained even. "Why me?" Rick tilted his head. "Just part of our pattern check. Mind showing ID?" Kyle glanced at Alana, clearly uncomfortable now. She slowly unzipped her bag and handed over her license. Rick read it aloud. Alana Brooks. A pause. Kyle's brow furrowed. Rick's eyes narrowed. Any relation to Charles Brooks? He asked, feigning casual interest. Alana met his gaze. He's my father. Rick chuckled under his breath. Sure he is. I'm not hiding anything, she said. You can check my bags, but I'd appreciate knowing why I was stopped. Rick handed her license back. We'll get there. Kyle shifted on his feet, stealing a glance at Alana's bag, then at Rick. Something felt off, not with her, but with this whole situation. And as Alana turned slightly to retrieve her boarding pass, Rick gave a subtle nod, an unspoken cue that Kyle had seen before. Not a cue for conversation, a cue for escalation. Rick Dalton stood with one hand resting casually on his belt, the other thumbing through a worn notepad he carried more for show than necessity. His eyes didn't leave Alana Brooks. She stood just a few feet away, her body language guarded but not confrontational. She had handed over her ID without hesitation, answered every question without attitude, and even kept her tone calm. But none of that mattered to Rick. His mind had already drawn the lines of a story. The facts were irrelevant. She's too polished, he muttered to Kyle Benson, barely moving his lips. This whole look, it's curated, overcompensating. Kyle glanced at Rick, trying to read between the lines. She's well dressed. That's not a crime. Rick scoffed. You're still thinking like a civilian. This is about patterns. You know how many times I've seen girls like her come through here? Designer shoes, clean nails, 3 phones in the bag, $1,000 backpacks, not a job in sight. Kyle frowned. That's not what this is. You don't know anything about her. Rick's smile curled upward. I don't need to. I've seen the type. Daddy's not in politics. He's a lawyer who launders money. Or a record exec moving product under the radar. Or she's tied to some rapper who sends her to Europe for kicks while he handles business here. She's got a diploma from UCLA, Kyle said, glancing again at the license. Rick snorted. Sure. And that just means she's smarter than average. They know how to move now. Don't get caught. Use family names. Use clean flights, nice clothes, fake innocence. But you start pulling threads, it all unravels. Trust me. Kyle looked back at Alana, who was now readjusting the strap on her bag and checking her phone. Nothing about her screamed danger. She was poised, alert, maybe a little tired from the flight, but that was expected. There was no sign of agitation, no suspicious behavior, just presence. That was her only offense, existing in a way that didn't fit Rick's script. Rick leaned in slightly, his voice dropping low. Let's see if she jumps when we press her. If she's clean, she walks. If not, we make a call. Kyle didn't respond. Something in his stomach twisted. He wasn't fresh out of the academy, but he hadn't yet lost the impulse to question what he was doing. This didn't feel like enforcement. It felt like baiting. But Rick was already moving again, signaling with a barely perceptible head nod that said, "Follow me or get out of the way." They stepped back toward Alana, now flanked by the 2 officers, with Rick taking the lead. His voice was smoother this time, dipped in artificial concern. "We're going to need you to come with us for a brief screening," he said. Standard procedure for passengers with international arrival discrepancies. Alana's brows pulled together. Discrepancies? Rick didn't blink. You were flagged for secondary inspection. Nothing to worry about, just a quick review. She glanced at Kyle. Is that true? Kyle hesitated, but Rick jumped in. It's routine. Happens all the time. Alana nodded slowly. All right, but I'd like to know what this is actually about. Rick smiled like a snake. We'll explain everything shortly. Please come with us. He gestured toward a service corridor leading away from the main flow of passengers. Alana, wary but cooperative, adjusted her bag and followed. Kyle trailed behind, his internal warning bells ringing louder now. As they turned into the corridor, the noise of the terminal dulled, replaced by the echo of their footsteps against linoleum. Rick opened the door to a small security interview room, windowless and dimly lit, the kind used for customs detentions and administrative delays, the kind of room where time seemed to stop and authority went unchecked. Alana stepped inside and paused. "Can I know your names?" Rick raised an eyebrow. "Officer Dalton. This is Officer Benson." She nodded once. "Thank you." He closed the door behind them with a solid, final thud. Kyle stood near the wall, hands folded, eyes flicking between Rick and the woman now seated before them. Rick circled the small metal table, arms folded behind his back. "Let's just go over a few things," he said casually. "Where have you been? Paris? Purpose of travel? Graduation trip? Who paid for it?" "I did. With money, I earned tutoring and a graduation gift." "Interesting," Rick said. "Most tutors don't wear $400 sneakers and carry MCM bags." Alana met his stare. "Are you questioning my fashion choices or my travel history?" Rick leaned forward. "I'm questioning how a young woman with no declared income manages luxury travel and designer gear. That tends to raise flags." "Because I'm black?" she said, voice flat. Kyle flinched. Rick's expression hardened. "Don't go there. We're just doing our job." "No, you're profiling," Alana replied. "You saw me, made assumptions, and now we're here." Rick smirked. "You're awfully defensive for someone with nothing to hide. And you're awfully aggressive for someone with no evidence," she shot back. Rick stood up straighter, clearly irritated now. He glanced at Kyle, who said nothing. "You're being uncooperative," Rick said. "No," Alana countered. "I'm being direct. There's a difference." Rick pulled a form from his clipboard. "If we have reason to suspect you're carrying contraband, we can detain you for a secondary search." "You don't have any reason," she said. Rick smiled again, cold and deliberate. "That's what we're about to find out." Kyle shifted his weight. "Rick," he started, but Rick held up a hand. "Step outside for a minute," Rick said. Kyle blinked. "Why?" "Just go. I'll call you when I'm ready." Kyle hesitated, then stepped out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Alone now, Rick turned back to Alana. He spoke slower this time. "Look, we can do this the hard way. Strip search, urine test, full intake, or you can make things easy." Alana narrowed her eyes. "What are you suggesting?" Rick's grin widened. "We both know people like you don't want records. Embarrassment. Your daddy wouldn't like that. Maybe we come to an understanding." Alana stared at him, blood pounding in her ears. Kyle paced outside the door, his hand hovering near the handle. He wasn't sure what was happening, but whatever it wasn't protocol. Inside, Rick's tone dropped. $5,000 in cash, and this all disappears. Kyle choked on his breath when he heard that last line through the thin metal door. He froze, and in that moment, the trap had been sprung on more than just Alana. The narrow service hallway behind the terminal felt colder than the rest of the airport. The hum of public activity faded quickly, replaced by the faint buzz of overhead lights and the occasional metallic creak of distant carts. Alana Brooks walked at a measured pace, flanked on both sides by officers Rick Dalton and Kyle Benson. She kept her back straight and eyes forward, refusing to show even a flicker of fear, even as the tension thickened around her. As they reached the small security interview room, Rick pushed open the door and gestured her inside. The space was plain. Stark white walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, and a surveillance camera that hadn't blinked in months. Alana stepped in without hesitation. "Take a seat," Rick said. She did, setting her bag gently on the floor beside her. Kyle remained standing just inside the doorway, his eyes darting between Rick and Alana. He had seen interviews before, but this didn't feel like an interview. It felt like something else entirely, like the beginning of a setup. Rick stayed standing, his arms folded tightly across his chest. He studied her with open judgment. "You got quite the collection," he said, motioning toward her shoes. "Limited edition Jordans, huh? What's the price tag on those? $500? Alana looked him in the eye. $350. Bought them with my own money. On sale. Rick tilted his head. And the bag? MCM. Birthday gift. Rick scoffed. From who? A boyfriend? Or does Daddy wire you money every time you want to play dress-up? Alana didn't flinch. Are you here to interrogate my fashion choices or conduct an actual screening? Kyle shifted uneasily. Rick leaned on the table. You want to know what I think? I think you're trying too hard to look clean, and that usually means you're not. Alana's lips pressed together. She took a steady breath. I cooperated. I gave you my ID. I haven't raised my voice or refused any request, and I'm still waiting to hear what this is actually about. Rick smiled, thin and condescending. This is about behavior, patterns, your route, your appearance, your timing. It adds up. To what, exactly? Alana asked. Suspicious activity, Rick said smoothly. That's all we need to start asking more questions. Kyle opened his mouth, but stopped himself. The words hovered, unspoken. Alana folded her hands on the table. You're inventing a reason to detain me because I don't fit your idea of what's acceptable. That's not suspicion. That's profiling. Rick straightened, his tone tightening. Let me be clear. Your attitude isn't helping. You show up looking like a walking billboard for street money, no clear source of income, straight off an international flight. Yeah, that's going to raise some questions. I told you exactly what I've been doing, she said. And the only thing you're reacting to is the way I look. Rick's expression darkened. You want to keep talking back? You think that's going to help you? Alana leaned slightly forward. I'm not talking back. I'm answering with facts. The law allows me to do that. Rick turned toward Kyle. Let's go. She's obstructing. Kyle hesitated. She hasn't refused anything. Rick snapped. Did you not hear me? She's being deliberately evasive. That's grounds for further detention. Alana stood up. This is ridiculous. Rick stepped closer. Sit down. No, she said calmly. I have complied. And unless you have legal cause, Rick cut her off. That's it. She's resisting. Kyle blinked. Wait, Rick, cuff her, Rick ordered, his voice sharp now. She's obstructing a law enforcement officer and acting in a suspicious manner. You want it in writing? I'll write it. Kyle froze. His hands hovered near his belt. His heart pounded. Every fiber in his body told him this wasn't right. She wasn't a threat. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't even raised her voice. Rick, he tried again, but Rick was already reaching for his radio. I said cuff her, officer, Rick growled. That's an order. Alana didn't move. She looked directly at Kyle now. You know this is wrong. Kyle's fingers twitched. Rick turned on him. Do your job. And just like that, the balance cracked. Kyle slowly pulled the handcuffs from his belt. His hands trembled as he stepped forward. Miss Brooks, he said softly, turn around. Alana didn't argue. She turned, held her hands behind her, and stared at the white wall in front of her. Her shoulders remained level, her breathing even, but inside her stomach twisted. Kyle slid the cuffs on, wincing at the cold metal snapping shut. His hand brushed hers and he felt the tension in her muscles. He couldn't look her in the eye. Rick nodded with satisfaction. Good. Now we can proceed properly. Alana turned back around slowly. Her wrists bound, her voice low. You're going to regret this. Rick smirked. That's what they all say. Kyle stood back, silent and ashamed. The air in the room felt thinner now, like something irreversible had just happened. Rick opened the door. Let's move her to containment. We'll start the search process there. Kyle didn't move. Rick stared. You heard me. Kyle exhaled slowly and took Alana by the elbow. She didn't resist. She walked with control, head high, expression unreadable. They passed a maintenance worker in the hallway who stopped briefly, eyes widening at the sight. He said nothing, just stepped aside. Another silent witness. Rick led the way, swagger in every step. Kyle followed behind, each footstep heavier than the last. And Alana, hands cuffed and dignity intact, walked down the corridor toward the next room. Not because she was guilty, not because she had anything to hide, but because two men decided she looked like someone who should. And just around the corner, a traveler with a vlog camera still recording stumbled onto the hallway, capturing the exact moment a young black woman was led away in cuffs without explanation. The instant Alana Brooks was led out of the corridor and into public view, the airport shifted. A single moment, captured in dozens of smartphone screens, slowed the pulse of the terminal. There she was, young, black, handcuffed, flanked by two officers, her stride tense but deliberate. Passengers stepped aside, eyes wide, expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. A child pointed. A woman lowered her sunglasses. A man with the carry-on stopped dead in his tracks. Then came her voice. "I am the daughter of Governor Charles Brooks," she yelled, the words reverberating off the terminal walls. "Call my father." It was not a plea. It was a command, sharp and furious, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a siren. For a moment, the crowd froze again, absorbing what they had just heard. Several heads turned. A few people instinctively reached for their phones, now recording not just a takedown, but a potential scandal. Kyle Benson flinched. His grip on her arm tightened involuntarily. Rick Dalton didn't even blink. "Keep moving," Rick barked, steering her toward the security door. "You're making a huge mistake," Alana spat, twisting her neck to make eye contact with anyone in the crowd. "They're profiling me. They have no reason." Kyle looked over his shoulder. Phones were up, cameras were pointed, people were whispering. Someone said her name aloud. "Brooks?" Another added. "Did she say Governor Brooks?" A woman in a business suit frowned and took a step forward. "Excuse me," she called out. "What's the charge?" Rick didn't answer. He swiped his badge at the scanner beside the secure entrance, shoved the door open, and pulled Alana inside. Kyle followed silently, the door shutting behind them with a mechanical hiss that muffled the outside world. But the damage was already done. Inside, the hallway leading to the secure containment rooms was eerily quiet. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting a clinical glare on the sterile floors. Rick walked ahead with confidence, keys and tools clinking lightly on his belt. Kyle trailed a half step behind, his expression unreadable. Alana said nothing now. The outburst had drained her, not of strength but of patience. Her wrists throbbed in the cuffs, her jaw clenched. She could hear the blood in her ears. Rick finally stopped at an unmarked door. He unlocked it, shoved it open, and nodded inside. The room was small, windowless, with white tile walls and a single bench. A mounted camera blinked red in the corner, but no one could say for certain whether it worked. Kyle had heard rumors it didn't. Rick didn't seem to care either way. "In," Rick said flatly. Alana stepped in on her own, turned and stood tall. "I want to make a phone call." Rick tilted his head. "We're not there yet. I know my rights." "You're not under formal arrest," Rick replied. "You're being detained for suspicious behavior." "That's not a legal category," Alana shot back. "That's an excuse." Rick took a step closer. Kyle didn't move. He stood by the door, staring at the floor. Rick's voice dropped an octave. "This is how it works. You get loud out there, fine. But in here, you listen. You cooperate." Alana looked him straight in the eye. "I told you who I am, and I don't care." Rick stepped back, exhaled, and gestured for Kyle to uncuff her. Kyle hesitated. Rick gave him a sharp look. Wordlessly, Kyle moved forward and began unlocking the restraints. The cuffs came off with a faint click. Alana rubbed her wrists red and marked. Kyle glanced at the bruises forming around the bone and looked away. She sat down on the bench, crossing her arms. "If you don't care who I am, you're going to learn very quickly how wrong that is." Rick paced slowly. "You think a name protects you?" "No," Alana replied. "I think a name makes you accountable." He chuckled. "Good luck with that." There was a pause. The room felt heavy with what had just taken place. 2 officers, cornering a citizen, cuffing her in front of strangers, ignoring her identity, ignoring basic protocol. Kyle finally spoke. "We need to document everything now." She gave her name. "If this goes sideways," Rick cut him off. "We're following protocol." Kyle swallowed hard. "Are we?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "You want to step outside again?" Kyle didn't answer. He just shifted his stance. Alana looked between them, her tone measured. "You have no idea what you've walked into, but you will." She reached into her bag, which she'd retrieved just before the detainment. Her hands moved slowly. Rick tensed, but she only pulled out her phone. "You planning to make a scene?" Rick asked. "No," she said, unlocking the screen. "I'm planning to call my father, unless you want to do it for me." Rick took a step toward her. "Give me the phone." She didn't. "I know the law. I'm not under arrest. I can make a call." Kyle cleared his throat. "Let her." Rick hesitated, then nodded. "Put it on speaker." Alana tapped the contact. The line rang. Once, twice. Then a deep voice answered, firm and familiar. "Alana? Dad?" she said, her voice suddenly raw. "They've detained me. I told them who I am. They put me in cuffs, in public." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Where are you?" "Port City Airport. Security room. I'm with 2 officers, Dalton and Benson." The voice changed, became steel. "Put one of them on." Rick stepped back slightly. Kyle went still. Alana held the phone out. "He wants to speak to you." Rick hesitated, then took the phone. "Who is this?" he asked, already regretting the question. The voice on the other end roared like a storm. "This is Governor Charles Brooks, and you just laid hands on my daughter." Rick's face drained of color. Across the terminal, in the same moment Rick Dalton froze with Governor Brooks's voice thundering through the phone. A different story was unfolding at Gate 32. Ethan Miles, a travel vlogger and self-proclaimed urban explorer, had unknowingly captured what would soon become a national flashpoint. He had been filming a B-roll segment for his YouTube channel, Fly Life with Ethan, when the scene exploded in front of him. A young black woman slammed in cuffs, yelling something about being the governor's daughter, surrounded by officers who moved with practiced force. He hadn't planned on going live, but instinct told him this wasn't a moment to edit later. This was now. His phone, mounted on a gimbal, caught it all. The arrest, the shouting, the crowd's reaction, the expressions of confusion and discomfort. He kept the camera steady as he narrated in real time. "Okay, guys, this is breaking. Port City International. A woman is being detained. She's clearly in distress. She's saying she's the governor's daughter. I don't know what's going on, but the cops aren't answering questions. This doesn't look right." Within minutes, the feed jumped from a few dozen viewers to thousands. Comments poured in. "Who is she? This is excessive. Wait, is this for real? Did she just say Governor Brooks? One viewer clipped the moment she shouted her name and uploaded it to Twitter. Within 10 minutes, the hashtag Justice for Alana was trending in California. By the time Rick shut the door of the security room behind him, the video had been viewed 170,000 times. Back in that room, Rick's expression was pale, his jaw locked, phone trembling slightly in his grip. Governor Brooks' voice had dropped to a deadly calm. "You will put my daughter back on the phone. Then you will give me the name and rank of your commanding officer. You will not touch her again. Do I make myself clear?" Rick didn't respond. He simply extended the phone back to Alana with a stiff arm. She took it silently, eyes locked on him as she put the phone to her ear. "I'm okay, Dad," she said softly, though her heart was still racing. "They've taken me into a back room. No formal charges yet. You stay calm," Brooks replied. "You don't hang up this phone. I'm dispatching my chief of staff and legal counsel now. I want a location. Give me the name of the officer standing in front of you." She turned the camera on her phone slightly, showing Rick's face. "This is Officer Rick Dalton." There was a beat of silence. "Good," said Brooks. "Now listen carefully. Do not resist, but record everything. Understood?" Alana nodded. Understood. She ended the call, opened her camera app, and hit record again, placing the phone face up on the table. Rick saw the red recording icon instantly. "You're not allowed to film inside a secure facility," he said, voice strained but trying to regain control. "You just falsely detained me," she replied. "Your department's policy manual, Section 3.4.7, permits civilians to record any interaction unless it compromises operational security. We're not in an operation. We're in a box." Kyle Benson said nothing. He stood frozen near the door, eyes on the phone, jaw tight. Rick turned away, pacing. His plan was unraveling, fast, but he wasn't ready to stop. "You can play lawyer all you want," he muttered. "None of this changes the situation. Suspicious behavior is still grounds for secondary detainment, and you haven't given a clear explanation of your finances or your purpose for travel." Alana raised an eyebrow. "Is that an attempt at justification? Or is that the start of your cover story?" Rick spun around. "You know what I think? I think you want this to become a scandal. I think you're hoping I mess up. You already did." His hands clenched at his sides. "Then maybe we help each other." She leaned back slowly. "Say that again?" Rick's voice lowered to just above a whisper. "You don't want this on record. Neither do I. It was a misunderstanding, a reaction to stress, wrong timing. But things escalate. People say the wrong things. Careers get destroyed. Reputations dragged." "You mean yours?" Alana said. Rick continued. "We could make this go away right now. You walk out of here clean. I file nothing. The footage disappears. And in return," she asked, tone flat. Rick hesitated. Then, 5,000. Kyle's head snapped toward him. "Are you serious?" Kyle said. Rick ignored him. "Cash? No trace. You get your dignity back. I get my piece." Alana blinked. "You're extorting me." Rick shrugged. "Call it a professional courtesy." The camera continued to record. Every word, every pause. "I don't have $5,000 in cash," Alana said. Rick smiled. "That's not my problem." Kyle took a step forward. "This is insane, Rick. You're going to ruin us." Rick turned on him. "Shut up." Alana reached into her bag slowly, then pulled out her wallet. "Let me see what I have." She opened it, then set it down. "Do you see $5,000 in here? Because I don't. And even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you." Rick's lips tightened. "Then I can't help you." Alana calmly turned the phone toward her, tapped once, and ended the recording. You just made my case stronger. Rick stood completely still. Kyle took a deep breath. We're being streamed. Rick spun. What? Kyle nodded toward the phone. Look at the top left corner. She went live. Rick lunged for the phone, but Alana had already locked the screen. Touch that again, she said coldly, and that's another count against you. His hand hovered, then fell. Kyle looked down, defeated. This is over. Rick's eyes flicked from Alana to the phone, then to Kyle. He breathed hard through his nose, then turned toward the door. Put her back in Holden, he said. No, Kyle replied. Rick stopped. What did you say? Kyle met his gaze. I said no. We're not continuing this. Outside the room, a low rumble could be heard. Commotion in the hallway, raised voices, footsteps, the sound of something big approaching. And Rick, unaware of just how fast the outside world had caught up, clenched his fists and said, Then I'll do it myself. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead light, casting shadows that clung to the corners like smoke. Rick Dalton stood across from Alana Brooks, posture relaxed, voice low, as if the entire world outside the concrete walls had ceased to exist. But the world hadn't stopped. It was watching, listening, waiting. You want this to disappear? He said, tone casual, like a man offering a cigarette in an alleyway. $5,000. No paperwork, no record, no story. Alana sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, shoulders square. The camera phone still sat on the table, face down, screen dark. She didn't look shocked, she looked disgusted. That's extortion, she said quietly. Rick smiled. That's negotiation. You want to walk out of here without headlines? I want something in return. That's called leverage. She tilted her head slightly. So that's what this is? Shake down the governor's daughter, hope she panics? I don't care who you are, Rick replied. Your name doesn't scare me. What scares me is paperwork, investigations, internal reviews. You think I want to explain this to brass? To media? $5,000 is mercy, and frankly, it's cheap for someone like you. She didn't blink. Someone like me? Rick shrugged. You know what I mean. Girls who walk around with $1,000 bags and entitlement leaking from their voice. You think that badge outside your door is your birthright. You people always think you're untouchable. Alana leaned forward, eyes locked. You're projecting. You're the one who feels untouchable. You think nobody's recording this? You think nobody's coming? Rick's smile cracked. You think I haven't been through worse? You're not the first to try and bluff, but usually the smart ones take the offer. Alana paused, watching him. Then she softened her tone slightly. Let's say I'm interested. I don't carry $5,000 in cash. I'm not stupid. So how would you want it? Venmo? Or should I just go to an ATM? Rick laughed, missing the shift in her posture. Cash. Tonight. We'll release you. Nothing gets written up. And if anyone asks, we'll say it was a routine check. Miscommunication. You flew off the handle. We de-escalated. Happens all the time. Tonight, she repeated, you call someone. Have them meet us outside the staff entrance. You hand over the money. You walk. Everyone wins. She nodded slowly. Okay. Rick raised an eyebrow. Okay. I'll call my father, she said, voice measured. Rick narrowed his eyes. That's a bold choice. She shrugged. You said yourself. He's rich. He'll send someone. Rick laughed again, shaking his head. You must really think you've got power here. No, she replied calmly. I just know how men like you work. You lean when you think no one's watching. You press when the doors are closed. But when the lights come on, you vanish. He smirked. You want to call Daddy? Be my guest. She reached for the phone on the table. Her fingers moved slowly, but with certainty. She tapped the screen, unlocking it with a facial scan. She moved to the voice memo app and hit record without letting Rick see. She opened the dial pad and began pressing numbers. Rick leaned back, arms crossed. Put it on speaker. Transparency, right? She didn't look at him. Of course. The line rang once, twice. A voice answered. Not the governor. A woman, calm, precise. This is Lydia Marshall, Chief of Staff to Governor Brooks. Who is this? Alana cleared her throat, adopting a tone of urgency but not panic. Lydia, it's Alana. I'm at Port City Airport. I need you to wire $5,000 in cash to a private location. I'll text you the details. No questions. There was a pause. Lydia's voice dropped half a tone. Are you in danger? No, Alana said quickly. I just need the money. Immediately. And I'll handle it from there. Lydia didn't argue. Understood. Text me the coordinates. I'll get someone moving in 15 minutes. Alana hung up and turned the phone face down again. It's done. Rick raised both eyebrows. That was fast. You people really are connected. She stood slowly, brushing imaginary lint from her sleeve. Where do you want the drop? He thought for a moment. Parking, garage C, southwest corner, ground level, no cameras, one person, unmarked car. She nodded. I'll text her. She picked up the phone again, typing with precision. But the message she sent wasn't to Lydia. It was to a secure line. Governor Brooks' direct legal team, previously programmed into her favorites. The message was short and direct. Initiate full protocol. Location, Port City Airport, Room 4B. Audio captured. Threat documented. Backup required. She hit send. Then she placed the phone back on the table, screen still dark, recording every second. Rick stood, now visibly relaxed. See? Was that so hard? Alana looked up at him, expression unreadable. You'll get your money, he chuckled. You're a lot smarter than you let on. She offered no reply, just watched him, measured him. Kyle Benson, who had remained silent for minutes now, shifted his weight again. He looked at Alana, then at Rick. Something unspoken passed through the air. Guilt, disgust, maybe both. Rick turned to him. Kyle, go wait by the garage. Make sure we don't have any unexpected guests. Kyle didn't move. Rick frowned. You deaf? Kyle slowly stepped forward. We're not taking that money. Rick's smile faded. What? Kyle pointed at the phone. She's been recording this entire time. Rick spun. His hand shot toward the table. Alana grabbed the phone first. Touch me, she said flatly, and I'll scream so loud this entire building will come running. Rick froze. Kyle stepped between them. It's over. Rick looked at both of them, fury building behind his eyes, then took a single step back. We'll see about that, because just outside the room, the pounding of boots could already be heard coming down the hall, and the door wasn't locked. Alana Brooks pressed the call button again, this time not to her father's staff, not through intermediaries, but directly to the man himself. She held the phone steady, thumb hovering over speaker mode. Rick Dalton stood a few feet away, still posturing, though less certain now. Kyle Benson remained closer to the door, eyes darting between the phone and his superior, knowing full well they were standing on a fault line. The line clicked. Alana, came the voice, strong, sharp, immediate. Dad, she said, keeping her voice even but loud enough for the room to hear. It's happening. I'm in a holding room at Port City International, 2 officers, no formal charges. One of them just tried to extort me. There was a pause. Not long, just the kind of silence that signaled gathering fury. Where exactly are you? Governor Charles Brooks's voice was deeper now, darker. Which officers? Alana's eyes didn't leave Rick as she answered. Officer Rick Dalton and Officer Kyle Benson. We're in holding room 4B. Rick's jaw tightened. He raised a hand as if about to speak, but no words came out. I need you to put one of them on the phone, Brooks said. Now. Alana held the phone out across the table toward Rick. He wants to talk to you. Rick stared at it like it was a live grenade. His skin paled, mouth opening slightly before closing again. I said, Alana repeated, he wants to talk to you. Rick took 2 slow steps forward and reached for the phone with one hand. The moment it touched his palm, the governor's voice came through the speaker with full force. This is Governor Brooks, he said, not shouting, but resonating like thunder compressed into syllables. Who am I speaking to? Rick cleared his throat. This is Officer Dalton, sir. Officer Dalton, Brooks replied. Why is my daughter in handcuffs? Why was she removed from public space without cause? Why are there reports on video of her yelling for help? Why are you ignoring her legal rights? And more importantly, why are you threatening her? Rick's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Answer me. There's been a misunderstanding, Rick finally stammered. She was behaving erratically, sir. We were following standard screening protocols. No, you weren't, Brooks snapped. You detained a private citizen without probable cause. You refused to release her after she identified herself. And you tried to solicit a bribe in exchange for silence. Am I missing anything? Rick looked around the room like someone searching for an escape route. You are to release her immediately, apologize and wait where you are. Do not leave that room. Do not touch her. Do not speak to her. And pray that when my legal team arrives, they find you in a state fit for questioning. Rick's hand trembled as he held the phone away from his face, then set it slowly on the table. Alana didn't look at him. She reached over, ended the call, and started recording again with a single, deliberate tap. You heard him, she said. Kyle exhaled audibly. Before Rick could respond, his radio squawked. Static crackled for a second, then a voice came through, calm but urgent. Attention all Port City security personnel. This is Captain Maria Torres. Officer Dalton, Officer Benson, report status and location immediately. Directive from the governor's office. Do not engage with the subject further. Secure your position and await command. Rick didn't answer the radio. He stood frozen, his entire frame locked in a posture of disbelief. He glanced at Kyle. Kyle spoke into his own unit. This is Officer Benson. We're in holding room 4B. Subject secure, awaiting instruction. There was no reply, but the channel went quiet. Then came the sound of movement. Multiple sets of boots pounding the hallway floor, sharp and synchronized. The rhythm of a tactical response team, not a routine patrol. Alana looked toward the door. Rick reached for his sidearm not to draw it, but to touch it reflexively, the way a drowning man might reach for a rope already slipping underwater. A sharp knock hit the door. Dalton, open it, came the voice from the other side. Female, firm. Rick hesitated. Another knock. I said open the door. This is Captain Maria Torres. Kyle moved before Rick could. He opened the door and stepped back as Torres entered. She wore a dark Navy command jacket, silver badge pinned over her heart, and a face carved in stone. Behind her were 2 officers in full tactical gear, both visibly tense, both recording body cam footage from the moment they stepped in. Who's the detainee? Torres asked flatly. Alana stood up. I'm Alana Brooks. Torres turned to her immediately. Are you hurt? No, Alana replied, but I've been held without cause and threatened. Torres nodded once, then turned to Rick. Where's the report? There isn't one yet, Rick stammered. Where's your probable cause? She was acting suspiciously. Where is the documentation? Rick swallowed hard. We didn't finish intake. You never started it, Torres snapped. You moved her without filing, detained her without charge, failed to report up the chain, and now the governor's office is calling this a breach of civil procedure. Sit down. Rick didn't move. I said, sit, Torres repeated, her voice low but lethal. He sat. Torres turned to Kyle. You're Benson? Yes, ma'am. Are you part of this? Kyle hesitated. I was ordered to assist. I didn't participate in the detainment. I tried to stop it. Do you have a body cam? Yes. Is it active? Kyle nodded. It's been rolling since contact. Torres nodded. Good. She turned back to Alana. We're going to get you out of here. Legal counsel is en route. I'm authorizing full cooperation. You're not to be touched again. Alana looked at her without speaking. She simply nodded. Torres turned to her team. Uncuff her. Now. One of the tactical officers stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs still hanging from Alana's belt loop. She rubbed her wrists and stepped back. Rick said nothing. His face was blank, hollow. Kyle stepped to the side, no longer guarding anyone. Torres turned back to the radio on her shoulder. Central, this is Captain Torres. Subject has been identified and released. 2 officers under direct review. Prepare internal documentation. I'll escort the complainant personally. Then she looked at Rick one final time. Stay in this room. Wait for internal affairs. If you leave, you will be arrested. Do you understand? Rick nodded mutely. Alana followed Torres toward the door, her steps even, controlled. And as they walked out, the camera phones outside were already raised because the story had left the room and the nation was listening. Captain Maria Torres stepped fully into the room, her presence slicing through the tension like a blade. She didn't need to raise her voice to command it. Her dark uniform was pressed, her boots were polished to a mirror shine, and her eyes were sharp with purpose. 2 tactical officers followed behind her, their body cameras blinking red, recording every second. The moment she saw Alana Brooks standing beside the table, her eyes dropped to the cuffs still locked around the young woman's wrists. Uncuff her. Now. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The weight of her authority landed with precision, and for a moment, no one moved. I said, uncuff her, Torres repeated, her voice tightening. Officer Kyle Benson jolted forward. His hands fumbled with the key as he moved to Alana's side. His fingers trembled, the small metal key slipping as he tried to find the lock. He took a steadying breath, made the turn, and the cuffs snapped open. Alana flexed her wrists slowly, the red lines etched deep into her skin, already beginning to bruise. Torres turned to Rick Dalton. Do you have any idea what you've done? Rick didn't answer. His mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. He looked like he wanted to speak, maybe even fight back, but the calculations behind his eyes had stalled. There was nothing to say. No spin, no procedural jargon, no cover to hide behind. You just handcuffed the daughter of the sitting governor of this state without a warrant, without probable cause, and without any supporting documentation, Torres said, each word deliberate. You refused to file a report. You ignored her request for a phone call. You attempted to coerce her into silence. And you did it all on camera. Are you aware of the magnitude of your failure? Rick finally blinked. She didn't identify herself until she identified herself multiple times. We have that recorded. You ignored her. You mocked her. You endangered the department, this airport, and your own career in less than an hour of contact. Kyle stepped back into the corner of the room, shoulders hunched. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear into the walls. Torres pointed to a metal chair. Sit down, Officer Dalton. Rick didn't move. Sit down. He obeyed this time. Slowly, Torres looked to one of her tactical officers. Secure the perimeter. No one goes in or out. I want this entire section locked until internal affairs arrives. You two, escort Miss Brooks to the command office. I'll join her once this is stabilized." The officer nodded, gesturing toward the door. Alana picked up her bag and phone, moving without a word. She passed Rick without looking at him. Kyle glanced at her, but she didn't return his gaze. Her silence was louder than any accusation she could have made. As she exited the room, reporters outside the terminal already had their cameras raised. The clip Ethan Miles had uploaded was now headlining national news outlets. Photos of Alana in cuffs were circulating alongside her graduation photo. People were drawing lines between justice and abuse, between power and helplessness, between assumption and truth. In the hallway, the noise grew louder. Footsteps, radio static, shouts from the other side of the corridor. Security officers from the airport's upper levels were arriving now, summoned by the governor's chief of staff and reinforced by state investigators moving fast to get ahead of the explosion. Back inside the room, Torres approached Rick's chair. "I'm placing you on immediate suspension, pending investigation," she said. "You will surrender your badge and firearm to my officer. Right now." Rick's hands moved slowly, pulling the badge from his chest and laying it on the table with a metallic clink. The firearm followed, set gently beside it like a relic of authority already gone. "I was just doing my job," Rick muttered, staring at the floor. "No, you were abusing it," Torres replied. "And now, for the first time in your career, someone's going to hold you accountable." She turned to Kyle. "You assisted in this detainment?" Kyle hesitated. "I followed his lead. I voiced my concerns. I hesitated when he told me to cuff her. I didn't push back hard enough." Torres's expression didn't soften, but her tone shifted. "You're going to write a statement. Every detail. From first contact to the moment I walked in." Kyle nodded. "You're also suspended. Pending review." His shoulders sank. "Understood." She motioned to one of her aides. "Escort both officers to Holden. Separate rooms, no phones, no contact." The aide signaled. Rick and Kyle were led out of the room, their steps uneven, heads down. Rick's swagger had vanished entirely. Kyle didn't look angry, just ashamed. Torres stood alone now in the center of the room, breathing slowly. The damage wasn't just procedural, it was cultural, structural. This wasn't a bad day, this was a reckoning. She reached for her radio. "Command, this is Captain Torres. I'm requesting activation of the emergency oversight protocol. I want an ethics officer on site within the hour. I want a full transcription of the incident. And I want every second of surveillance footage from Terminal B and Room 4B in my office before midnight." "Confirmed," the voice responded through static. Torres paused at the door before stepping out. This wasn't going to blow over. It wasn't going to be swept under the rug. The clips were online. The phone call was real, and the public wasn't waiting for an internal memo. Outside, Alana was already being escorted through a corridor of raised cameras and flashing lights, her face calm, bruises visible, the pressure building with every step. And in that moment, a single truth had become undeniable. This was no longer about one young woman. It was about a system that had finally run out of excuses. Officer Jessica Kim had been standing at the far end of the surveillance corridor when she first noticed Rick Dalton veering off the assigned patrol path. It wasn't unusual for him to break from protocol. He had a reputation for doing things his own way, but something about the way he moved that afternoon set off a quiet alarm in her gut. She had seen him do this before. Spot someone he didn't like the look of, change course, create justification out of nothing. But this time felt different. This time, the tension had a charge, and the girl he was trailing had presence, confident, composed, like she knew she didn't belong under suspicion. Jessica had followed from a distance, staying out of view. She watched from behind a terminal column as Rick and Kyle stopped the young woman, asked for ID, and began escalating. It was all too fast. There was no conversation, no legitimate cause. The girl handed over her documents and stood her ground, and still Rick moved toward confrontation. Jessica had wanted to intervene then, but the chain of command was rigid. She was junior, still technically on probation after her transfer to the airport unit, and Rick had clout, tenure, allies, history. Speaking out against him meant risking her career before it even began. So she waited. She observed. She stayed within earshot as they led the girl, Alana Brooks, she would later learn, into the secondary screening room. When the shouting began, Jessica had moved closer. She heard enough through the thin walls to know this wasn't a routine stop. The tones were wrong. The silence between sentences was longer than it should have been, and Kyle's voice, barely present, sounded strained. She heard mention of money, a threat, then a phone call, then the footsteps of Captain Torres charging in like a storm front. Jessica hadn't been asked to write a report. She hadn't been directly involved. But that evening, as she sat in the quiet of the locker room, uniform folded over her knees, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Not this time. At 6:42 p.m., and she submitted a formal misconduct report to the Office of Professional Standards, detailing her observations, the timeline she tracked, and her first-hand account of the atmosphere surrounding the detainment. She didn't embellish. She didn't speculate. She laid it out plainly. Rick Dalton had targeted a traveler without cause, ignored de-escalation protocols, and used his position to intimidate both a civilian and a fellow officer. She didn't expect what came next. By 7:15, a supervisor knocked on the door of the small cubicle where she was finishing her shift paperwork and asked her to step into a conference room. Waiting inside were 2 representatives from the Internal Affairs Division and 1 public relations officer from the governor's liaison office. They asked her to repeat everything. She did, word for word, calm, clear, and firm. At 7:53 p.m., someone leaked the existence of her statement to the press. By 8:10, her name was trending on Twitter. Jessica Kim, the quiet officer from Koreatown with barely 2 years on the force, had become a symbol, an insider willing to speak against the culture of silence. News anchors speculated about her motives, her background, her bravery. Commentators demanded to know why no one else had come forward sooner. Civil rights groups praised her, while union reps scrambled to issue neutral statements about due process. At 9:03, Jessica received a call on her personal line. "Ms. Kim," the voice said, "this is Alana Brooks." Jessica froze. "I heard what you did," Alana continued. "Thank you." Jessica took a breath. "I just did what was right." "No," Alana said. "You did what was hard. That matters." They didn't speak long, just a few minutes, but the connection was enough to spark something larger. When Alana later gave her first extended interview to a major news outlet, she mentioned Jessica by name. There was one officer who didn't look away. She didn't grab my arm. She didn't join in. She wrote the truth down when no one asked her to. That's integrity. That clip aired on every major cable network. Within 24 hours, Jessica was standing in front of a row of microphones, not because she wanted to be, but because the public now saw her as an anchor point in a storm of chaos. Her supervisors hadn't blocked the interview request. In fact, they had encouraged it. "I'm not a hero," she said, voice steady. "I just think uniforms don't give us the right to forget that the people we deal with are human beings. I saw something wrong. I had a choice. I made it." The moment that quote hit social media, it was clipped and posted under a new hashtag, #not all look away. While outrage over the incident had ignited, first because of Alana's status and Rick's abuse of power, Jessica's quiet defiance gave the story emotional depth. People who hadn't connected to Alana now found themselves identifying with Jessica, someone within the system who dared to call it broken. That same night, Jessica received hundreds of messages, some supportive, some angry, many emotional, from fellow officers, from former detainees, from citizens who had watched someone get profiled and said nothing, from students, from mothers, from strangers. One message stood out. It was from Alana again, shorter this time, just 5 words. "I don't feel alone anymore." It was that line, posted later to Alana's social media, that became the center of a powerful editorial the next morning. The silence is breaking, and it's breaking from within. By the end of the week, the internal investigation expanded. Jessica's testimony matched surveillance data, timestamps, Kyle's admission, and the full audio recording Alana had submitted. There was no room for doubt. Rick Dalton had collapsed not from force, but from exposure, and Jessica Kim had turned on the light. The investigation into Officer Rick Dalton moved swiftly, propelled by public outrage, mounting evidence, and direct pressure from the governor's office. What had begun as a single high-profile incident now opened a floodgate. Internal Affairs officers combed through Dalton's personnel file with renewed intensity, uncovering inconsistencies, gaps in documentation, and repeated patterns of questionable conduct buried beneath bureaucratic language. The first red flag was from 6 years prior. An informal complaint filed by a 22-year-old black college student who claimed Dalton had detained him outside the airport's drop-off zone without cause. The incident report described it as a routine stop. The student's statement, however, told a different story: an aggressive approach, racial slurs, and a warning that someone who looks like you should know better than to hang around this place. No body camera footage was available. The complaint was quietly dismissed with no disciplinary action taken. The second complaint surfaced 2 years after that. A black airport employee alleged that Dalton had repeatedly stopped her during her shift breaks, questioning her credentials and suggesting she didn't look like she belonged in that role. Again, the report filed by Dalton described his actions as routine badge verification. The woman's formal complaint was labeled unsubstantiated due to lack of corroborating witnesses. She transferred departments shortly after. The third instance was more recent, just 14 months before Alana Brooks' case. A tourist from Atlanta filed a written complaint stating that Dalton had stopped him in the customs line and accused him of carrying counterfeit goods. The man produced all the proper receipts, but Dalton reportedly continued to interrogate him aggressively for nearly 30 minutes. The traveler was eventually released without apology. The report again cited procedural justification. No further review occurred. 3 incidents, 3 different people, all with consistent claims: targeting, escalation, and humiliation based on race. And in all 3 cases, Dalton had walked away clean, until now. Internal Affairs compiled these files, cross-referenced badge activity logs, reviewed training history, and questioned colleagues who, under the weight of a formal inquiry, began to speak with increasing honesty. A pattern emerged. Rick Dalton was known to patrol by instinct, often stepping outside of assigned zones, stopping passengers not flagged by the system, and taking pride in finding trouble before it started. Some junior officers admitted they had felt pressured to follow his lead. Others said they avoided shifts with him altogether. A retired supervisor, contacted during the inquiry, gave a recorded statement confirming that several minor complaints had been diverted away from official review to protect department image. Dalton was seen as old school, the former sergeant explained. He had backing. You didn't challenge him unless you wanted to feel it later. This time, however, the walls were closing in from all sides. The governor's legal team submitted a formal request for the reopening of all previous complaints involving Dalton and any cases in which he was the primary reporting officer. The request cited systemic misconduct and potential institutional shielding of racially motivated abuse. Within hours, oversight from the State Department of Justice was authorized. The pressure was no longer just internal. National media outlets were now using Dalton's name in headlines alongside phrases like culture of impunity and systemic profiling. Editorials demanded accountability not only for the incident involving Alana Brooks, but for the failures that had allowed Dalton to remain in uniform for over a decade, despite repeated signs of misconduct. When news broke that at least 3 prior complaints had been improperly filed, the backlash was immediate. Civil rights attorneys announced plans to represent previous complainants pro bono. A prominent law school published an op-ed titled "The Cost of Looking Away," when procedure replaces accountability. A retired black officer wrote a widely shared essay describing how good cops were often silenced by the culture of self-preservation. Public trust in the Port City Airport Security Division, already shaken, now plummeted further. The department held a press conference on the morning of the 4th day after Alana's detainment. Captain Maria Torres, flanked by legal counsel and 2 state compliance officers, stood before a row of microphones. She didn't spin. She didn't hedge. She laid out the facts. Officer Rick Dalton is now under full suspension pending disciplinary hearings, she said. His badge has been surrendered, his access revoked, and his prior record is being reviewed by an independent oversight committee. Additionally, Officer Kyle Benson has also been suspended due to failure to intervene and failure to report misconduct. These actions are part of a broader investigation into procedural failures, supervisory lapses, and systemic vulnerabilities that contributed to this incident. She paused, let the flashbulbs pop, then continued. We are not only investigating what happened last week, we are investigating what allowed it to happen at all. The announcement was broadcast live. That afternoon, Kyle Benson was served with a formal notice of suspension. Though his conduct had been less aggressive than Rick's, his silence and complicity had made him liable. He had not reported Rick's demand for money. He had hesitated when he could have stopped the handcuffing. In the eyes of the law, omission under pressure was still negligence. Kyle accepted the notice without resistance. He gave a full statement. He admitted to everything. Though visibly shaken, he did not ask for leniency. I failed her, he told Internal Affairs, not because I was angry or hateful, but because I froze, because I thought not rocking the boat was safer. It wasn't, and it shouldn't be. Rick Dalton, meanwhile, refused to cooperate. His attorney released a terse statement denying all accusations and criticizing trial by media. But inside the department, the mood had shifted. No one came to Rick's defense. No one called it a misunderstanding. The silence that had once shielded him now surrounded him like a void. The door had finally opened on a truth long denied. Rick Dalton had been protected by a system built to avoid embarrassment, not prevent abuse. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed. Within 24 hours of the incident, the hashtag Justice for Alana surged to the #1 trending topic on Twitter across the United States. It had begun with a single live stream, a shaky phone video uploaded by a travel vlogger named Ethan Miles. But now it had become a rallying cry, a national symbol of everything that people had feared, suspected, or experienced firsthand when it came to racial profiling, police abuse, and the quiet machinery of systemic protection. The video, less than 2 minutes long, had been reposted across all platforms, accumulating over 20 million views in its first day. The moment Alana Brooks yelled, "I am the daughter of Governor Charles Brooks," while being shoved into a security room, became a GIF, a meme, a soundbite repeated across cable news panels. The visual of her in handcuffs, wearing stylish joggers and sneakers, her face caught between disbelief and defiance, flooded every corner of the digital landscape. But not everyone agreed on what it meant. The public conversation fractured almost immediately. One camp saw it as proof of deep-rooted injustice. They cited her calm demeanor, her legal compliance, the escalation without cause, and the attempt at blackmail, all as evidence that the problem wasn't her identity, but the badge that stood against her. Civil rights leaders pointed to the incident as a textbook example of how racial profiling operated, not with open slurs, but with subtle assumptions, veiled threats, and unchecked power. They organized under the banner of accountability. Petitions launched. Protest events were planned. Artists illustrated Alana with her wrists bruised, her head unbowed, surrounded by words like truth, resist, and protect her. High-profile celebrities reposted the clip with captions like, "This is why we march," and "Still happening in 2025. The other side, however, spun a different narrative. They called it an overreaction. They said Alana had weaponized her status, pointing to her last name and her confident tone as proof she expected special treatment. Some framed her as another entitled elite, exploiting her family's position to manufacture outrage. Phrases like special privilege, performative victimhood, and reverse racism littered comment sections and anonymous message boards. Political commentators on certain networks leaned into the angle of class warfare. "This is not a race issue," one anchor insisted. "This is about power. This is about someone who knew she was above the rules and expected to walk through without question." The hashtag #privilege parade briefly trended as a counterpoint. The cultural divide only deepened when financial records, selectively leaked to media outlets, revealed that Alana had received significant graduation gifts, including a car and an overseas trip. The implication that she lived in a world far removed from the average citizen and had no right to claim the mantle of victimhood. In response, Alana said nothing publicly. She refused interviews. She stayed out of the spotlight, letting the video and the facts speak for themselves. But her silence didn't slow the noise. By day 3, public demonstrations had begun. Outside the airport, crowds gathered, some holding signs that read, "She had a name, but not a shield," others with "No more excuses." In front of City Hall, chalk outlines of bodies were drawn across the pavement with the words, "What if she was your daughter?" beside them. At colleges across the country, student groups organized walkouts in solidarity. The mounting pressure did not go unnoticed. Governor Charles Brooks, who had remained measured in his statements so far, now addressed the public directly. He stood at a podium in the state capitol press room, flanked by legal advisors and policy officials. His suit was crisp, but his voice carried more edge than polish. "This is not about who my daughter is," he said. "This is about what was done to her, and how many times it has been done to others whose names never make the headlines." He paused, letting the silence settle. "There are those suggesting this is about privilege. Let me be clear. We are not asking for mercy. We are not demanding special treatment. We are not looking for favors. We are demanding justice. And we are demanding it for everyone who has ever been ignored, humiliated, or violated under the pretense of law." The room was silent. Then the flashbulbs exploded. The statement was carried live, repeated on headlines across every major outlet. "We're not asking for mercy. We're demanding justice." It became the new refrain. It overtook hashtags. It recentered the conversation. Because now, the question wasn't whether Alana had deserved to be treated better, it was whether anyone did. Following the governor's speech, the State Department of Justice announced it would conduct a full review of detention procedures and internal complaint handling within the Port City Airport Police Force. The review would be public, transparent, independent, and its findings would be published in full. In the days that followed, dozens of people came forward, travelers, employees, former detainees, offering their own stories of interactions with Officer Rick Dalton. Some were eerily similar to Alana's. Some were worse. Some had tried to file reports, but had been discouraged. Others never spoke up because they believed no one would care. Now, suddenly, people were listening. Jessica, Kim's internal statement was made public with her consent. Her quiet courage under pressure became a lesson in integrity. Schools used the clip in classroom discussions about ethics and policing. One high school civics teacher wrote online, "My students believe in justice again, because someone inside finally stood up." Meanwhile, Kyle Benson's decision to speak truthfully during the investigation earned him both condemnation and praise. Some called him weak. Others called him the first domino. Either way, the blue wall had been cracked. Social media continued its dual chorus: celebration and outrage, inspiration and cynicism. But beneath it all, something else had begun to emerge: momentum. People no longer asked whether Alana's story was real. They asked what it meant for them, for their families, for the system. The airport released a formal apology. The department's acting chief stepped down. Training protocols were reviewed. Cameras were added to previously unmonitored rooms, and a new hotline was created for anonymous complaints, one that reported directly to the governor's office. The ground was shifting, and at the center of it, Alana Brooks, still silent, watched as the system that tried to crush her began to feel the weight of its own reflection. The set was minimal, lit with a cold glow that reflected the serious tone of the moment. A single chair faced a glass table across from veteran CNN anchor Dana Ellis, whose career had seen more than its share of high-profile interviews. But this one was different. This wasn't a celebrity, a politician, or a talking head. It was a young woman who, by simply surviving and refusing to be quiet, had ignited a national reckoning. And tonight, for the first time, Alana Brooks was ready to speak. She wore a dark blue blouse, sleeves rolled to the elbow, wrists uncovered and still faintly marked. Her hair was pulled back, not styled for dramatics but for honesty. She sat with perfect posture, chin high, eyes calm. When the camera light blinked red, and the producer counted them in silently from behind the glass, she didn't flinch. Dana leaned forward first. "Alana, thank you for being here." Alana nodded once. "Thank you for asking the right questions." A beat of silence. Then, softly, "Why now?" Alana took a moment before answering. Her voice was controlled, but her words landed with precision. "Because it's not just about me anymore. And it never really was. I needed to sit with that. I needed to understand what it meant to be seen not just as a victim, but as a symbol. And I needed to make sure that when I did speak, it wasn't to reclaim my voice. It was to give space for others who still feel voiceless." Dana gave a slight nod. "You said something during our pre-interview that struck me. You said, 'I am alive because of my name.' Can you explain what you meant?" Alana didn't blink. "I said that because it's true," she replied. "I was not treated as a citizen. I was not respected as a person. I was not heard until I said who my father was. Until I named power, I was just another black woman being handled. But the moment they heard the name Brooks, everything changed. And that's the problem. I am not safe because I am right. I am safe because I am connected. And that should terrify all of us." There was no applause, no reaction, just heavy silence in the studio as Dana let the weight of her guest's words linger. "What has this experience taught you?" Dana asked. Alana folded her hands in her lap. It taught me that systems don't fail. They perform exactly as they're designed. And this one was designed to ignore people like me, unless I gave it a reason not to. The segment ran for 43 minutes and was broadcast live. Alana did not cry. She did not shout. She did not dramatize. And because of that, the country leaned in. The clip of her saying, "I am not safe because I am right," was reposted within minutes and recaptioned as a statement of generational truth. The response was immediate. Civil rights organizations held joint press conferences calling for new regulations on airport security protocols and civilian stop-and-hold procedures. One national group, the Coalition for Equitable Enforcement, released a formal proposal titled the Alana Standards, which recommended mandatory third-party oversight on all non-warrant detentions in transit zones. University professors hosted forums dissecting her interview line by line, inviting students to reflect on the intersections of race, privilege, and institutional power. Clergy leaders gave sermons. Community organizers printed signs with her words. Protesters showed up at state buildings wearing tape across their mouths with only her initials written in black ink. Social media flooded with messages. Survivors of racial profiling began sharing their own stories under a new hashtag name or nothing. The implication was clear. If you couldn't name someone powerful, your rights were negotiable. In a small town outside Baltimore, a middle school teacher played the interview during her civics class. When it ended, one student raised her hand and asked, would she be okay if her dad wasn't famous? The teacher didn't answer. She didn't have to. News networks debated policy implications. Conservative voices called the reaction overblown, pointing again to Alana's background, education, and perceived status. One anchor questioned if her experience was truly representative of systemic abuse. But even in that space, cracks began to form. A retired law enforcement captain appeared on air and said, "You don't need to have experienced something 100 times for it to matter. Once is enough when it looks like this." Donations poured into legal aid organizations representing citizens unlawfully detained during travel. A previously obscure bill requiring independent review of detentions at state airports was suddenly resurrected in committee with bipartisan interest. The governor's office issued a formal statement endorsing the bill and promised to include provisions for racial bias training, recording standards, and clear channels for civilian complaints. The echo of Alana's words, plain, unadorned, began to shape policy language. Meanwhile, Alana stayed quiet again after the interview. She returned to her apartment, refused all additional media requests, and did not post on social media. She told her father she needed to think, not strategize, not spin. Just think about what came next, about how to move through a world that now saw her differently, and how to make sure the focus didn't drift back into the comfortable inertia of outrage fatigue. The silence she carried into that interview had not come from weakness. It had come from calculation. She had waited, watched, and when she spoke, she made it impossible to look away. And now, for the first time, the public realized that the silence they had once dismissed wasn't absence. It was protest. It was volume in a different form. Because the silence of someone who survives injustice isn't empty. It's filled with everything they've had to carry just to get to the point where speaking wouldn't destroy them further. That night, during a live panel discussion, a political analyst said, "This wasn't an outcry, this was an indictment," and it landed. The moderator turned to him. "So what's next?" He answered without hesitation. "Now we see if we actually want to be the country that deserves someone like her." The press conference was called at exactly 10 km. Local and national media packed into the city administration building. Cameras mounted, microphones clipped to podiums, and live feeds already rolling as the countdown began. Outside, a crowd of demonstrators stood behind barricades. Some held signs with Alana's face, others with messages like "Justice is not optional" and "Reform the gatekeepers." The moment was not just procedural, it was symbolic. Captain Maria Torres stepped onto the podium alone. She didn't bring legal counsel. She didn't surround herself with department brass or union officials. She stood beneath the seal of the Port City Airport Authority with only a folder in her hand, her expression steady but undeniably grave. "Good morning," she began. "I'm here to speak to the public not as a spokesperson, not as a political actor, but as a police officer who failed to prevent harm under my command." She took a breath and continued. 2 weeks ago, a traveler named Alana Brooks was detained unlawfully inside this city's international airport. She was profiled, she was humiliated, she was handcuffed, and she was threatened by individuals wearing this badge. She paused. The room was silent. "I have reviewed the footage, read every report, listened to every recording, and interviewed every witness. What happened was not only a violation of departmental protocol, but a betrayal of public trust, and for that, I take responsibility." There were audible gasps from reporters. She hadn't used the words alleged or pending. She had called it what it was. "I want to offer a direct apology to Miss Brooks, her family, and every individual watching this who saw their own experience reflected in hers. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not expect applause. I expect change, and I will make sure it begins here." The flashbulbs burst like lightning. Reporters shouted questions, but Torres raised a hand. "Before we take questions, I want to share developments regarding the officers involved." She opened her folder. "Officer Kyle Benson has agreed to cooperate fully with the ongoing internal and external investigations. He has submitted a sworn statement, turned over all communications and recordings, and accepted administrative suspension pending review. In his own words, he failed to speak when silence became complicity. That admission does not erase the harm, but it is a necessary beginning." She flipped the page. "Officer Rick Dalton has retained legal representation. He has declined to be interviewed by internal investigators, citing Fifth Amendment protections. His attorney has issued a statement denying all allegations. He remains suspended without pay." A hush swept the room. "Let me be clear," Torres said. "This department will no longer treat silence as a shield. We will not protect those who use the law to serve themselves." The press erupted with questions again, but Torres only took one. A reporter from a national outlet asked, "Captain, is this incident being treated as an isolated case or part of a larger review?" Torres nodded. "That brings me to the final point." She stepped back slightly and gestured to a monitor now being turned on by a staffer behind her. On the screen appeared the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. "This morning, I was notified that the DOJ will be launching a formal review of stop and search procedures in transportation hubs across the country. The case involving Alana Brooks will serve as the foundational example, a model investigation from which national policy may be reformed. This is no longer just about Port City. This is about how America decides who gets questioned, who gets cuffed, and who gets to walk away." The monitor displayed the title of the newly opened inquiry, Federal Civil Rights Case 4205, Brooks v. Dalton et al. The words etched themselves into the public narrative like a gavel strike. It wasn't just a scandal, it was precedent. Outside, the news spread instantly. Protesters cheered, some in disbelief. One mother held her daughter's hand and whispered, "She changed something." Local business owners closed early to join the growing crowd downtown. College students live-streamed their reactions. Across the city, television sets tuned into the same image. Captain Torres, hands folded, standing alone but unshaken. Inside the building, as the press conference ended and Torres stepped away from the podium, her staff swarmed her for immediate next steps. Legal representatives were already on their way to coordinate with federal attorneys. Airport Security Council members scheduled emergency ethics hearings. Victim advocacy groups submitted amicus briefs before the press conference had even concluded, and behind closed doors, Department of Justice officials worked to finalize their designation of the Brooks case, not as a localized violation but as a pattern or practice case, a legal categorization allowing the federal government to oversee and restructure local agencies found to be engaged in systemic misconduct. The implications were seismic. Policy experts predicted sweeping reform proposals within months. Some called for the mandatory use of third-party mediators during all secondary detentions in major airports. Others suggested real-time civilian oversight panels and independent review boards for law enforcement working in federally funded transit zones. But perhaps the most significant impact came from an unexpected direction. Legal scholars began to cite the Brooks case as a test bed for redefining the limits of qualified immunity. Constitutional law professors at Yale and Stanford issued joint statements suggesting that Alana's treatment exposed not only the vulnerabilities of travelers, but also the unchecked legal shield worn by those with badges. Meanwhile, Alana stayed silent. She didn't issue a statement following the press conference. Her interview with CNN stood alone, and that choice itself became a message. While others spoke on her behalf, she remained centered, composed, and deliberately quiet, allowing the system that tried to contain her to unravel in its own noise. Rick Dalton's attorney appeared on local news that evening. He dismissed the press conference as premature, warned of political theater, and claimed his client was a dedicated officer being sacrificed to appease a media frenzy. But the tide had turned. No statement could erase the footage. No spin could undo the bruise on Alana's wrist or the tone of her voice when she said, "I'm alive because of a name." The Department of Justice's decision to elevate her case meant something larger than guilt or innocence. It meant the rules were being rewritten. And as the investigation widened, the questions changed, from what happened to Alana to how many other Alanas never got the chance to say their name. The courtroom was packed before the gavel struck. Press badges dangled from every neck. Legal analysts lined the first two rows with pens poised and recorders rolling. Armed marshals stood along the walls, their expressions blank. The seal of the state of California loomed over the bench, flanked by the flags of the state and nation, but all eyes were focused on the defendant's table, where Rick Dalton sat in a dark gray suit, hands folded tightly in front of him, jaw locked. His attorney whispered in his ear, but Rick didn't nod, didn't move. He stared straight ahead. Kyle Benson sat at the adjacent defense table, separated by 2 marshals and 3 feet of courtroom carpet. He looked down at the floor, not at anyone in the room. He wasn't in cuffs, but the guilt on his face bound him tighter than steel. The judge entered, a middle-aged woman with salt gray hair and a reputation for brutal clarity. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and called the case into session. State of California versus Rick Dalton and Kyle Benson. Charges: unlawful detainment, attempted extortion, civil rights violation under color of law, and racial discrimination under Penal Code, Section 422.6. Mr. Dalton, how do you plead? Rick's attorney rose. Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor. Mr. Benson. Kyle stood. His voice was quiet, but firm. Guilty, Your Honor. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge nodded. So entered. She turned her attention to the prosecution. Proceed. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Leah Garcia, walked to the center of the courtroom with the confidence of someone holding a loaded arsenal. She didn't waste time with theatrics. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a case about misunderstanding. This is not about poor judgment or bad communication. This is about authority abused, race weaponized, and power used as a tool to humiliate. The victim in this case, Alana Brooks, was handcuffed, detained, and offered a deal. Her freedom for $5,000. That's not policing. That's extortion. She paused, then continued. And it wasn't hidden. It wasn't hearsay. It was recorded. You will hear the words from the defendant's own mouth. You will see the moment it happened. Live on camera. There is no guessing here. There is no ambiguity. The defense responded with a counter-narrative that Rick Dalton had followed protocol under tense circumstances, that Miss Brooks' reaction escalated the incident, and that any mention of payment had been misconstrued as a misunderstanding. They leaned heavily on Dalton's years of service and suggested he had become a symbolic target in a politically charged environment. But, as opening statements ended, the tone of the room made one thing clear. This trial was no longer just about Dalton. It was about whether the justice system would finally say out loud what so many had known for years. The first days of testimony established context, airport protocol, use of force policies, the chain of command during detainments. Witnesses included airport supervisors, legal compliance officers, and 2 employees who testified they had seen Dalton act aggressively toward non-white travelers in the past. None had filed formal complaints. All admitted to being afraid of retaliation. On day 4, the prosecution introduced the evidence that shifted the room's energy permanently. They played the audio. From the courtroom speakers came the clear, steady voice of Rick Dalton. $5,000. No paperwork, no record, no story. The jury sat still. Then Alana's voice. "You're extorting me." And Dalton's reply, "Call it a professional courtesy." The jury didn't flinch. They listened. Some of them looked visibly sick. The prosecution followed with the live stream video captured from a travel vlogger's phone, showing Alana being handcuffed, crying out, "I haven't done anything wrong," as Rick ordered her into the security room. The angle was shaky, but the audio was sharp, and the image of her wrists in cuffs left no room for doubt. Then came Kyle's testimony. He took the stand, swore the oath, and told the entire truth. "I was told to cuff her," he said. "I knew it wasn't right. I didn't stop it. I didn't report it. When Officer Dalton suggested she pay him to make it go away, I heard it. I froze. I was scared of losing my job, but that doesn't excuse what I allowed." He turned to the judge. "I plead guilty because I was guilty, not of hatred, but of fear, and that fear made me dangerous." His testimony landed like a confession in a cathedral, quiet, heavy, irrevocable. The defense tried to dismantle it, called him weak, suggested he had cut a deal. But Kyle didn't waver. He answered every question. He admitted everything, and he never once looked away from the jury. In cross-examination, Rick refused to testify. His attorney shielded him from the stand, arguing that the prosecution's case was built on emotion, not fact. But the facts had already spoken. The evidence wasn't hearsay. It was time-stamped, broadcast, verified, and corroborated by federal investigators. By the end of the second week, public interest in the trial had exploded. Viewership spiked every time the courtroom stream went live. Commentators debated every line of testimony. News crawlers ticked across the bottom of screens. Brooks' trial, extortion audio. Played in full, Dalton silent, Benson. Admits guilt, justice, or politics. But in the courtroom, amid all the noise, the truth was building, brick by brick, line by line. This was not a trial about whether Rick Dalton had made a mistake. It was a trial about whether the badge he wore had been used to protect or to prey. and for the first time, the answer was being spoken in a court of law, not as allegation, but as evidence. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. 12 men and women, diverse in age, background, and expression, took their seats, each face marked by the weight of what they were about to deliver. Judge Marilyn Heller adjusted her glasses, glanced at the foreman, and gave a small nod. "Madam Foreperson," she said, "has the jury reached a verdict?" The woman stood, paper in hand, voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." She handed the folded sheet to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. The judge opened it, read for a moment, then looked up at the room. "In the matter of the state of California versus Officer Rick Dalton," she began, "on the charges of unlawful detainment, attempted extortion, civil rights violation under color of law, and racial discrimination. How do you find?" The forewoman's voice rang out across the room. "Guilty on all counts." There was no gasp, no exclamation, just a wave of air shifting across the gallery like an invisible hand brushing through bodies. Rick Dalton sat perfectly still, but his right hand clenched around the edge of the table. His attorney closed his eyes. Judge Heller continued. "In the matter of the state versus Officer Kyle Benson, on the charges of failure to report misconduct and aiding unlawful detainment, the jury has accepted a plea agreement. Sentencing to follow." She set the verdict aside, hands folded. "For Officer Dalton, the sentence is as follows: 3 years in state prison with no option of early parole. For Officer Benson, the court accepts the prosecution's recommendation: 18 months probation, the permanent revocation of peace officer certification, and prohibition from holding any future position in law enforcement or public security." Kyle didn't cry. He didn't smile. He simply lowered his head and whispered, "Thank you." Dalton stared at the judge, unmoving. "You disgraced your badge," she said, voice calm but resolute. "You manipulated authority to coerce, humiliate, and intimidate. You enforced your bias instead of the law. This sentence is not vengeance. It is accountability, and it is only the beginning." With that, the gavel struck. Reporters surged. Cameras flashed. Outside, the crowd waiting on the courthouse steps exploded into cheers, chants, and tears. The moment was plastered across every screen in America within minutes. Breaking. Rick Dalton sentenced to 3 years. Kyle Benson banned for life from law enforcement judge calls case. Beginning of accountability, but inside Alana Brooks, the storm didn't subside. She sat in the third row, surrounded by her legal team and family. Her mother's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. Her father's jaw was tight, his face unreadable. She watched Rick Dalton being led away in cuffs, the very same cuffs he had once tightened around her wrists without cause. But the image didn't bring her peace. It didn't bring relief. Justice had been served. The law had spoken. But something inside her remained unsettled. Outside the courthouse, she walked past the microphones without speaking. Her team had already notified the press that she would not be giving any statements that day. Her CNN interview was still the only one. It would remain that way for now. As they approached the waiting car, a reporter called out, "Alana, do you feel safer now?" She stopped for just a moment, turned her head slightly, but said nothing. Then she got in the car, closed the door, and disappeared into the traffic. In the days that followed, op-eds praised the verdict as a historic milestone. Civil rights leaders held rallies declaring it a template for future cases. Law schools updated curriculum modules with courtroom transcripts. Policymakers cited the case in committee hearings as momentum grew for reform bills nicknamed the Brooks Measures, which included stricter regulations on detainment, clearer oversight chains, and independent civilian complaint audits. But Alana remained quiet. She returned to her apartment, resumed her studies in graduate school, and tried to re-enter a rhythm that no longer existed. Something had shifted permanently. She couldn't go back to being anonymous, even if she wanted to. Not after being turned into a symbol, an avatar of injustice and resilience. Her face was known. Her voice was archived. Her silence now said as much as any speech ever could. One night, weeks after the sentencing, she sat at her kitchen table long after the tea in her cup had gone cold. She stared at her phone, reading messages from strangers, survivors, students, grieving parents. Many thanked her. Some apologized on behalf of systems they never controlled. Others asked questions she couldn't answer. How do I move forward after being erased? What do you do with the anger that doesn't go away? Does it ever stop feeling like they got away with something, even when they didn't? She locked the screen and closed her eyes. Her wrists still felt the memory of the cuffs. Her ears still heard the echo of Rick's voice. Her chest still tensed every time she saw a uniform. It didn't matter how many people told her she was brave, or how many laws were changed in her name. The fear wasn't theoretical. The humiliation wasn't past tense. Justice had consequences, but so did trauma, and hers didn't end in the courtroom. The next morning, her father asked her to speak at a policy summit in D.C., to stand beside lawmakers drafting the national version of the reforms. She told him she wasn't ready. He understood. Later that day, she stood in front of her mirror, pulled the sleeves of her sweater halfway up, and looked at the faint marks still visible. She raised her phone, took a photo, and posted it without caption. The image spoke for itself. It didn't need a speech. It didn't need hashtags. It didn't need rage. It just needed truth. Because sometimes the price of a cuff isn't measured in court minutes or prison years. It's measured in memories, in silence, in the way a person moves through the world after learning just how easily their humanity can be dismissed. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floor above. Outside, city lights flickered against the windows, casting soft rectangles across the hardwood floor. Alana Brooks lay on her back in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers she had yet to ask for. It had been 22 days since the sentencing. 22 days since the cameras had flashed, the judge had spoken, and Rick Dalton had been led away in cuffs. 22 days since Alana had left the courthouse without a word. And in those 22 nights, she had not slept through a single one. Tonight was no different. Her body was tired. Her mind was not. When her eyes did close, they brought with them flashes of memory, fragmented and looping in no particular order. The hallway, the cold tile of the airport floor, the fluorescent light in the security room that buzzed faintly overhead, the metal of the handcuffs tightening around her wrist, the voice, Rick's voice, flat and transactional. $5,000. No paperwork, no record, no story. Sometimes the dream was linear, the scene replaying exactly as it happened. Other times it twisted. In one version, the cuffs never came off. In another, the crowd at the terminal didn't stop to watch. They cheered. She would wake up with her heart pounding, throat dry, eyes damp and unfocused. Sometimes she sat up gasping. Sometimes she couldn't move at all. The worst part wasn't the handcuffs. It wasn't even Rick's face. It was the silence in the dream, the silence of the people watching. That silence haunted her. She had become, whether she liked it or not, a face for something bigger than herself. But at night, in the stillness of her apartment, she was just a woman who had been violated in public and had to carry it into the privacy of her own thoughts. She sat up slowly, swung her legs over the edge of the bed, and pressed her feet against the cold floor. The clock on her nightstand read 3:12 a.m. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the light, and made tea, not because it helped her sleep, but because it gave her hands something to do. As the kettle boiled, she opened her laptop. For weeks she had ignored emails from publications, talk shows, universities. Some were respectful, others were performative. All wanted her to say something, to represent something, to prove something. She wasn't ready. Not for them. Not for sound bites. But tonight she opened one that had been sitting in her inbox for a while from an editor at the Washington Post. Not a request for an interview, not an invitation to a panel, just 6 lines. If you ever want to write something, we'll print it exactly how you want. No edits, no framing, your voice, your terms, no deadline, just say when. She stared at the message for a long time. The kettle whistled. She turned off the stove, poured the water, and carried the mug to her desk. Her hands still trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. The kind of tremble that comes when the body is processing things the mind can't yet name. She opened a blank document. For a while she just sat there. Then she began to type. The first time I was handcuffed without cause by Alana Brooks. She didn't begin with anger. She didn't begin with the courtroom. She began with the moment she first heard the word suspicious, used as a substitute for black. She described being 10 years old, walking through a bookstore, and being followed by a clerk who smiled too hard. She wrote about being 16 and stopped outside her own school, keys in her hand, accused of lingering near vehicles. She wrote about the slow buildup of moments that felt small at the time but became enormous when they all stood in a line. She didn't focus on Rick Dalton. She didn't even name him directly. She wrote about power, about systems, about silence that allows cruelty to pass as routine. She wrote about what it meant to speak out and be heard only when her last name came into the room before her. And she wrote about what it means to be alone in a room full of people, everyone watching, no one moving. Then she wrote one line that she didn't edit, didn't rephrase, didn't explain. The crowd saw me cry, but no one saw me stop crying. By the time she finished, the sky had begun to shift, the dark giving way to a dull gray as the first light of morning slipped across the city. She read it once, then again. Then she clicked reply to the email and attached the document. Her message was simple. Here it is. Run it as is. No changes, no interviews, just this. She hit send, closed the laptop, and sat in silence again. But this time, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not hollow, just still. For the first time in 22 days, she felt tired in a way that might allow her to rest, not because the fear had left, not because the dreams would stop, but because she had turned the story into something she owned. Not a headline, not a courtroom exhibit, her voice, her way. The article, published on a Sunday morning. By Sunday evening, it had been shared over 3 million times. By Monday, it had been translated into 7 languages. The Washington Post did not change a word, not even for formatting. The headline stood alone in bold black font. The first time I was handcuffed without cause by Alana Brooks. There was no photo, no tagline, no editorial framing. And that somehow made it louder. Readers sat with it, teachers printed it. Survivors underlined passages, commentators quoted it on air. One university student shared it with the caption, "She didn't write to be understood. She wrote so we'd stop pretending we already did." Alana received thousands of messages. Some were from strangers, some from students, others from parents and travelers and quiet people who had never written public messages before but felt compelled to say, "I didn't know how to name it until you did." She didn't respond to most of them. She couldn't. But she read each one, and then she did something that surprised even herself. She said yes. The first request came from a community college in upstate New York. A student group invited her to speak on a panel about race and civil liberties. She almost declined. Then she remembered what she had written. The crowd saw me cry, but no one saw me stop crying. If she didn't show up, the silence would fill that space again. So, she boarded the flight. At the event, she sat on stage beside two professors and a policy advocate. When it came her turn to speak, she didn't read from notes. She simply told the story, plainly and fully, as if it had just happened. There were no dramatics in her voice, no tears, just honesty. When she finished, the auditorium stayed quiet for several seconds before applause began, slow, soft, then rising into something collective. After that, more invitations came. She visited small campuses and large ones. Some schools gave her honorary awards. Others paid nothing and only offered gratitude. She didn't care about either. She came for the conversation, not the spotlight. At each stop, she said the same thing. I'm not here to be a symbol. I'm here to remind you what happens when silence is mistaken for consent. She wasn't a motivational speaker. She didn't promise change. She didn't tell them what to believe. She only asked questions. What would you have done if you had seen me in cuffs? Would you have stepped forward or pulled out your phone? Why does someone need a famous last name before we listen? Sometimes the answers were brave. Sometimes they were clumsy. But the rooms were always full. People stayed after. They lined up to thank her, to cry quietly, to admit truths they had kept to themselves. Some brought their children. Some brought their past. Each night she walked away exhausted, but not empty. Back in California, her father watched quietly. Governor Charles Brooks did not comment on her article. He did not stand beside her at events. He didn't make a speech about her bravery. Instead, he did what she had taught him to do. He listened. He watched the replays of her panels on YouTube, alone in his office. He read the transcripts of her Q&As, noting where she paused, where she emphasized, where she chose not to speak. He listened not as a father trying to protect, but as a policymaker trying to understand. And what he heard changed everything. Late one night, he sat with his senior legal advisor in the governor's mansion, reading aloud a line from her article. I was treated like a threat, not because of what I did, but because someone didn't like how I looked doing nothing. He set the paper down. We've reformed the policies, he said. We've trained the officers. We've changed the procedure. But none of that stops the decision being made before the system even starts. What do we do about that moment? The advisor said nothing. Then, let's write a law that starts there, Brooks said. Over the next 3 weeks, his administration drafted what would become one of the most comprehensive civilian protection bills in the country. It addressed detainment transparency, mandated third-party review boards for travel-related stops, created statewide databases of officer complaints accessible by the public, and required implicit bias screenings as part of annual certification renewals for all law enforcement agencies operating in transportation zones. It also included something no previous bill had touched, a policy of required bystander obligation. That is, a duty for nearby law enforcement and authorized personnel to intervene or report when witnessing a violation of protocol during a stop. Silence under this law would no longer be neutral. The bill was titled the Civilian Integrity and Accountability Act, but the press renamed it. They called it the Alana Bill. When she heard the name, Alana winced. She hadn't been consulted, and she didn't want to be the face of legislation she hadn't written. But when she read the text, carefully, privately, she nodded, because it wasn't performative. It wasn't political theater. It was structured change, built from the truths she had spoken and the questions she had asked. She still didn't give a public endorsement, but she allowed her father to quote her article during the signing. Standing behind the podium on the state capitol steps, surrounded by community leaders, lawyers, and quiet victims whose names the world had never heard, Governor Brooks looked into the crowd and read one line. The crowd saw me cry, but no one saw me stop crying. Then he set the paper down. This law doesn't fix everything, but it will make sure that the next time someone like my daughter is stopped without cause, the people watching will be obligated to do more than observe. They will be bound to act. He signed it with a single stroke, and across the crowd one young woman stood near the back, wearing sunglasses and a dark coat, arms crossed. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She just nodded once, then walked away. It was passed quietly, without fireworks or spectacle, just a roll call vote and the scratch of signatures in ink. But what it represented roared louder than any press conference. Alana's law, as it came to be known, was signed into state code 6 months after the trial, mandating that all civilian stops in public spaces, especially in transit zones, must be accompanied by active body cam footage, a clearly stated reason for detainment, and a follow-up review within 72 hours by an independent oversight board. Any stop found to be unjustified would result in immediate suspension of the officer involved, with the footage made publicly available unless sealed by court order. It was more than a policy, it was a warning. 47 other states introduced versions of the law within the first year. 3 passed it within weeks. The rest, though slowed by politics, held hearings, citing Brooks versus Dalton as the case study. Civil liberties organizations published digital toolkits for activists. Universities studied the law in criminal justice programs. A new standard was being built, and it all began with one woman who once had to scream her last name to be heard. But Alana wasn't chasing legislation. She was chasing a deeper question. Months after the law's passage, she took the stage at the National Security and Civil Liberties Conference in Washington, D.C. It was a room filled with suits, officials, legislators, policy advisors. She wore black, no notes, no script. She stood behind the podium, waited for the room to settle, then asked only one thing. "If I weren't the daughter of a governor," she said quietly, "would I be alive today?" No one moved, no cameras, no live stream, no viral video, just me. Just a young black woman with no last name that mattered. Would I have been taken into that room and never come back out? The silence was absolute. "That is the question this system has to answer," she said. "Not to me, to itself." Clips of that moment spread in under an hour. The sentence was typed, retweeted, reprinted, and projected onto buildings. Activists painted it on signs. Students quoted it at rallies. Journalists made it a headline. "If I weren't the daughter of a governor" became not just a question, but a mirror the justice system could no longer avoid. But for Alana, the most important echo came not through screens, but in a quiet knock. It was after another campus speaking event in Atlanta. The hall had emptied, the applause had faded, and her team was packing up when a woman approached. She was elderly, wore a faded green dress, walked slowly but with pride. Her voice trembled with age, not fear. "I've been waiting a long time to see you," the woman said. "My name is Deborah Turner. In 1987, I was pulled from a bus station in this very city, said I fit the description. That officer's name was Rick Dalton." Alana froze. "No one believed me," the woman continued. "I wrote letters, went to the station, asked for a lawyer. They said I was making it up. I lost my job. I never got an apology. But you made the world stop and listen." Alana stepped down from the stage. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions. She simply wrapped her arms around the woman and held her tightly. Deborah held her back. No camera captured it. No caption was needed. They stood there, 2 generations, bound not by blood, but by truth delayed and finally seen. Tears fell. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that embrace was something more powerful than justice. It was recognition. Months later, Alana walked alone into the terminal at Port City International Airport, the same one where her life had changed. The walls had new posters now, policies posted, oversight information clearly displayed. Every officer wore a body cam. She didn't flinch when they looked at her. She didn't lower her gaze. She kept walking. No headlines followed her that day. No crowd gathered. But somewhere in the system, protocols had shifted. Standards had changed. Eyes had opened. She wasn't a symbol anymore. She was a catalyst. And when she stepped outside into the sunlight, she smiled, not because it was over, but because it had only just begun. She no longer lived in the shadow of that security room. She had walked through it and reshaped the door behind her. This wasn't the story of a victim. This was the story of a survivor who refused to be erased, who chose to turn her silence into law, her trauma into blueprint, her name into something more than protection. It became proof that change, no matter how delayed, can still arrive. And as her voice echoed through classrooms, courtrooms, and corridors of power, she carried with her the message that outlasted every trending hashtag. Not everyone has a name that makes the system pause, but everyone deserves to be treated as if they do. So now the question turns to you. If it were you, stopped, dismissed, erased, would anyone listen? And if you were the one watching, what would you do? Share this story. Keep it alive. Let it be the voice that doesn't get cut off again. Subscribe to hear more voices like hers, voices that changed everything simply by refusing to stay quiet.